Personally, so I'm really excited for this session because, as most of you probably know and what we've heard this evening, there's so much activity happening right at our doorsteps at the moment, so I can't wait to sort of get it from the ground level of the coalface. And now most of these questions I've got this evening that I'll be presenting to the guys, you guys have actually given to us through your registration form, so I really appreciate that, thank you, and hopefully I can do them justice. Firstly, I think we'd like to start with some stuff around the local market. Mark, I might start with you. In the last 6 months or so, and from what you've told us, I believe property prices are going up, there's low stock levels in the market, lots of buyer demand, auction clearance rates are out of control. Now, what do these indicate for people of the market, buyers, sellers?
Yeah, so from a buyer's point of view, I suppose that you've generally got a bell curve when people are buying a property. So you've got, something equivalent to your innovators, and they're the first ones into a marketplace, and then you've got your early adopters, and then you've got your early majority, then your lagging majority, and then after that, you've got people who are generally resisting doing anything. It's definite that we're in the early majority stage now, where everyone's cottoning on to the fact that there's a lot happening in Newcastle, and I think there's a lot more potential for that, just because of those big macro drivers that I told you about. So from a buyer's point of view. From a seller's point of view, it's a great time to sell if you're looking to cash in. There's options there where you can build more equity by taking some out and going and buying another property as well. But there's certain markets that have had a really good, strong stint of growth. Those particular suburbs are unlikely to have the same amount of growth in the years to come because they've had a spurt. So there's a lot to be said for people who trade property and grabbing the big gain while the sharp part of the curve is there, and then going and buying into another preeminent market. So that's the sort of opportunity out there for both parties at the moment.
Great. Now we've touched on a fair bit this evening around the CBD and all the development and stuff that's happening there at the moment. There is a bit of concern that possibly we might see oversupply in the future. I'm not sure how far down the track. Wayne, what can you say to that? I know you work a lot on the developments coming up in the CBD.
Yeah, look, that's a question that I probably get asked on a daily basis at the moment with the amount of prospective apartments that are in the newspaper. I think first of all, what gets reported as might happen and proposal doesn't always end up happening. I mean, if we go back to 10 years to when the last major window of opportunity was there, probably about 30% of the stock that was proposed and even DA approved, there was an awful lot of DA approved apartments that still haven't come out of the ground. They probably never will because they're probably not viable anymore. So first of all, probably all that stock won't come out of the ground. I think we're in a very different marketplace now than we've ever seen in Newcastle. As Mark touched on, a lot of the infrastructure will change the way that Newcastle will be forever. More than ever we're seeing, such as Sydney has seen for the last 20 years, people that really want to live and work in the city. They're choosing the option of giving away backyards. So I think you're going to find that there'll be a greater percentage of people wanting to come and live in the city than we've ever seen. We've got more people than I've ever seen in my 36 odd years of being in property wanting to invest in property in the city. So the depth of the market is certainly a lot bigger than I have ever seen in history. And look, the city is getting better. So as the city improves, as Mark touched on before, it'll compound and more people will want to come to the city.
So we're talking about all this extra stock coming on the market, but I mean, what sort of stock is it? We're looking at studios for the uni students coming in. Is there actually opportunities for people to residentially own occupiers, buy and move in there as well?
Yeah, so there's a large percentage right now. The flavour of the month right now is studios and one-bedders because there's such an appetite for it. It's very readily consumable by the market and a very sweet spot in the market. It works well with things like self-managed super fund, first-time investors with all their incentives that they've got. But you'll find in most developments they're very conscious of the product mix. So there's a flavour of the month for that right now, but there'll be key sites that come up, whether it's along Honeysuckle near the harbour or something that's got some great views. And those upper levels, they'll generally put some 2s and 3 bedders in there. It's all about what's feasible for the developer. But when you've got a lot of one type of stock, if there's a limited amount of a new type of stock and it starts selling again, then that's when they create more. So the developers are constantly trying to forecast with the agents on where that's going to be. So I'd say there's going to be a good blend of owner-occupied stock as well as that student and investment type of property.
Ty, I might just get your feedback here as well. In terms of commercial property, with all of this development and stuff, in terms of residential happening in the CBD, what sort of impact and flow and effect does that have from a commercial point of view for those of our audience that might consider buying commercially within that area as well?
It's really important to look at. Employment is obviously what we put inside business property, so commercial property needs to be located close to people who can work there. On the Central Coast, what we found is there's still a lot of people commuting to Sydney and some to Newcastle, but mostly to Sydney en masse every day because there's not a lot of employment on the Central Coast for that part of the market. Up here, certainly in Newcastle, I think employment patterns have shifted with what you've got happening with the mining areas and things like that as well. But that's kind of said and done now. Newcastle, the face of Newcastle is changing, and there's going to be a lot more employment with all of this development as well. So commercial property is important to find in an area where there is employment, but it generally won't arise without that employment sort of being around it in the first place.
Great, thank you. Now I've got a question here in regards to the rail corridor, which keeps popping up this evening. We're talking about the train line stopping at Wickham, and a light rail is now being proposed to come in and replace the rest of the CBD area. I've got a few questions here around what sort of impact that's going to have on properties within that area. Mark, I know you've got a lot of new developments coming up that follow that sort of rail corridor. What sort of impact will it have on those properties?
Well, that's the lifestyle and amenity of the whole area, so that's the first thing. There's been numerous studies done around the world about how light rail has impacted a city in a positive way, and you get people that wouldn't have usually used the rail start to use it, so they're actually using their city and starting to use the amenity that's right around them. So there's that side of it. Then there's the fact that it's going to open up what is currently our CBD, which is only just starting to blossom, and it's going to open up to the harbour, which is this touristic and natural resource that we've got. So, there's been people looking at, well, what's it going to be used for? Well, one of the great things that I think that the planning side of the government are trying to do at the moment is trying to engage the community more, and there's been an overwhelming demand for more civic space. And by removing that rail corridor and actually running it down the street that's already there, down Hunter Street, you've got a lot of space that they can put into civic space. So places to hang out, fountains, kids play equipment, pop-up cafes, things along those lines. Will there be some development in there? I certainly think so, because it makes sense practically for more people to be living in around that space. And it also makes sense that they can raise some money off those sites. But that just adds to the appeal of having an inner city atmosphere. So I think it's extremely positive that some of that land is being unlocked.
Glenn, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Oh, I think, there's no doubt that while there's good debate about the rail corridor, that it certainly has cut off the developing part of Newcastle from the existing part of Newcastle. So it's good to see it coming back to just being one Newcastle, where people can just transition to and from the foreshore. I think that it'll boost both sides of the old rail. And look, it is the new way of transport. I think if you look in any of the major cities that are developing, light rail is an integral part of that.
Now, Ty, just quickly, it might go down to the Central Coast. We've talked a lot about, what's happening in the residential market of Newcastle and things like that. Are there any new exciting developments that are happening in the Central Coast, Tuggerah area that you might want to share for anyone considering an investment down there?
Yeah, the Central Coast as a whole is a massive geographic area. Tuggerah is certainly a hot spot at the moment. We've got the Mariners development there, which is $60 million plus development, which is quite large, including the soccer fives. There's a YMCA swim centre, there's a childcare centre, a 10,000 square metre office building, plus there's going to be a travel lodge, some sort of hotel with basically an eatery around that, 3 or 4 restaurants. That's just in one little precinct. You've got the freeway, and between Westfield and the freeway they own a massive area of land. So there's about 50 hectares of land that's going to be basically subdivided into residential, 2 20-storey apartments as well, another massive bulky goods area. There's also a $500 million odd development that's in the area as well. It's going to be basically smaller residential lots, a touristy sort of thing. And I can't go into a lot of detail with that because that's in the early planning stages, but it's in that general area. And so you've got a 5-kilometre radius with massive development happening for that area. It's nothing like what's happening in the centre of Newcastle, because Newcastle is a major city in Australia. The Central Coast is not a major city, but it is large regional development, large-scale regional development. development definitely there.
So we're still going to have you as the neighbour soon?
Yeah, definitely.
Perfect. Now I've got quite a granular question. This one's sort of relating to the Cameron Park Wallsend Estates. Now that the expressway's opened up, what sort of impact do you think this will have on rents and rental properties, investment properties, that sort of thing in those estates? Wayne, I might throw this to you because I know you've got an agency opening up in Wallsend shortly.
Well, I mean, the Cameron Park, that growth corridor out there through there, I mean, that western area is the growth corridor of both Lake Macquarie and Newcastle. I mean, it is the only area where residential land can be developed in both Newcastle and Lake Macquarie can go out the western area, but that is the predominant areas. For Lake Macquarie, Glendale and Argenton, that area around there is an enormous area of growth and will probably become the focal commercial sector of Lake Macquarie as well around there. So, you know, with the freeway on the doorstep there's still a lot of people transitioning both north and south along the freeway, so you'll probably see the residential area grow right out to the edge of the freeway over the next 10 years. From a Newcastle point of view, well, we've heard about the possible rezoning of land out through Minmai, a lot of that coal and allied land, and also up through the back of Black Hill, which is sort of bordering on the Maitland district. So that freeway is an integral part. You'll find these days that the state government especially is pushing for growth along transport corridors, where there's even the discussions about building over rail corridors in through Sydney, where people can virtually just go downstairs, hop on a train and go into the CBD. So transport corridors are integral to the future of development.
I wish I had that when I lived on the northern beaches. Alright, so we've talked a bit about some positive stuff. I now thought we might touch on the property spruikers type of thing, which is probably not as positive. Wayne, you and I have spoken in the past where you've had instances of clients coming to see you following property developers, putting people into, you know, over-promised properties and promising to over-deliver, and it's not being obviously delivered on. For those people, you know, might be considering or have this sort of presented to them, what sort of tips would you give them to put in place to avoid being taken down the wrong track?
Yeah, well, first of all, you know, Mark and Ty would agree that, you know, as real estate agents, we work in probably one of the most highly governed legislative arenas that there is in the country. So, and you know, the licensing regime, that's very tight. But there are people that work on the edges of these regimes that are possibly not licensed under the Property Stock and Business Agents Act and not licensed under the Financial Services Act, that go out there and encourage people to buy property. Now, what we've found over the last 5 or 6 years especially is that some of these spruikers charge enormous fees. I mean, we're hearing fees of up to $50,000 on top of the cost of getting into them, so whether it's house and land or apartments. And the problem is that a lot of these costs are hidden, they're not disclosed, as we have to disclose all of those fees that we were involved in. And for the investor, their fees that are taking up their future equity, sometimes it can take 4 or 5 years to gain that back in equity, apart from the fact that the investment potential simply isn't there. We're seeing devastation in areas such as the Upper Hunter through Singleton through Muswellbrook, where, you know, where rents they were getting for a package that they paid $500,000, they were getting $600 a week. Now they're struggling to get $400 a week, and there's literally hundreds of properties left, unrented. So dangerous stuff.
Have you got some horror stories there you can share?
Yeah, well, those particular sort of two-tier marketing schemes, if you'll see it, they sort of have a lot of hype surrounding them. So it's always good to actually, even if you get told about an area, and you do have a lot of faith in what that potential, let's not say spruiker, let's just say you've come across an investment network, it's good to talk to the local agents on the ground in that area and say, look, how does this stack up? How does this compare to something that you might be able to offer? Just like you would when buying a car, especially if you haven't been into that area before, because one of the things that can happen a lot of the time is that there's an estate that might have had great potential, but that areas adjoining it only have, say, 15-20% investment property, and then the rest of them are owner occupiers. They then go and fill an estate with investment properties, and you've got 50 properties at the same time trying to rent out. Now, the ones in the adjoining suburbs may well have got $450 a week, but there's only 15 homes in there renting. You put another 50 in there, and the supply and demand, which is that critical factor that drives rental and sale prices, is totally washed out. On top of the fact they paid more for that property than they needed to. So you're talking a long-term recovery period just to get your money back.
And Ty, do you see this happening in the commercial industry?
Not so much in commercial, but I do see it still happening in residential, and I can think of examples of large companies that are turning over massive hundreds of millions of dollars a year that are just absolutely skinning people alive, but doing it in such a way that it looks like they're helping them to grow their portfolio and their nest egg. And whilst it's wrong, that part of the market is not as governed as, say, what we do, or childcare industries, for example. There's a lot of industries out there that are heavily governed, and I understand you've got to take care of kids, we've got to take care of our clients, we've got to disclose everything, there's no secret commissions or anything like that. But when you get on the edge of development, it's very, very easy to palm off large fees to get people put into things that they don't even come and see half the time, and they believe that they're going to be getting rents like that for a long period, and they won't, because it's supply and demand.
Interest rates. They've been low for a very long time now. I'm sure you've all got an opinion on maybe how much longer you see these staying at this low level. Do you want to go with Mark first, using your ideas on interest rates?
There's a few property economists that have a very close tie to speaking about interest rates. Dr. Andrew Wilson's a good one to follow. He speaks on Domain a lot in Australian Property Monitors. And look, the last few forecasts I've seen tend to think that it could be around 12 months, kept at a very similar rate. But either way, we're at an all-time low with these interest rates at the moment. You can lock them in if you want that sort of security, and it's just a great time to be getting a positive cash flow from a property. But I maintain that a great investment property's got 20% deposit in it. So that if you're only borrowing 80%, you don't have the mortgage insurance most of the time. And even if the rates go up a little bit, the rents tend to go at a similar sort of rate, but even if they don't, you can generally still cover the majority of that outlay on that property when you're 20% in. So I don't watch it as closely as I watch the good old supply and demand.
Wayne, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, look, there's so many things these days that govern interest rates, and we hear about them on the breakfast shows. But I think we've still got a good period of at least 12 months of low interest rates before we start to see the curve turn. Because the economy has still got some problems throughout it. I mean, unemployment's still rising in various sectors. The retail sector is still suffering greatly, although improving in some positions. I mean, the construction industry improving is a good sign. If it continues to improve, you'll probably see that there'll be pressure then for interest rates to go up.
Mark just mentioned that generally rents will go up in line with interest rates somewhat. Does that happen in commercial real estate as well? It
does. The thing that you've got to understand with borrowing for commercial property is you need to put much more equity into the loan. So you basically have a lower proportion of equity against debt in residential typically. The returns that you get alternatively though with commercial property are much higher. So you're looking at typical, if you've got a 5-year lease or a 7-year lease or a 10-year lease, you might get somewhere around circa 8 to 9% return. You probably lock a loan in at 5.25%. So I think the low interest rates are basically going to stay low for probably a little bit longer. I would like to think maybe another 2 years, but it could be 12 months. But for commercial property, if you can get a good lease, it's more about locking that in so that you know how much rent you're basically going to get. Rents and capital values with commercial property are driven by different things. So yeah, I think really focus on just getting a long-term lease with a rent that you know is going to be sufficient to pay the loan, and then locking a low interest rate now. That's probably good advice.
Great, thank you. Now, just quickly before I get each of your hot tips to finalise the evening, I'd like to open up a couple of questions to the floor. Is there anyone that has any pressing questions they'd like to put forward?
Just one question.
Damien?
Just the effect of the ageing market. So you're talking about the development of the CBD in particular, and the 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom places. I assume that the appeal of that has also got some drivers with the ageing population. Do you see that as people moving out of the Sydney areas, looking for more, nice place to live, are they seeing, Newcastle finally as that sort of place in the CBD?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. My parents have just sold out of a house in Hamilton South. The typical 550 square metre block, big house with a pool, and they're into a top floor apartment in town, getting amongst the lifestyle and locking it up on the weekends rather than spending time on the edges. So there is definitely a shift towards that, but what's driving that is the amenity. So the amenity of the city is bringing people out. You can now go through Newcastle and there's something like 15 different sort of wine bars, after dark venues for mature people and visitors to come to town. There's good food, there's tappers, there's people opening their doors to make it a more interesting place to hang out with your friends and to visit and to live. So you do need those catalysts first to drive it, but we do have an ageing population as well, and as we know, the baby boomers have a very good proportionate savings compared to some of the other demographics out there.
You kept looking at me when you were saying that.
I'm not going. I'm looking at you to see it's
You get my credit card statements.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, quickly while we finish up, I'd just like to get from each of you, if you can say one thing to the audience tonight as either a forecast or hot tip for them to take away. Do it in under 1 minute, and Ty, I'll start with you.
Buy commercial property. Honestly, there are really great areas in the area that I know, and I do know my area well, but there are great areas in every different part of the country to buy commercial property, and I'm not saying put all your eggs into one basket, because I totally agree that your principal place of residence is the best tax haven that you can possibly get, and that's where you should have probably most of your money. If you put, people say, put all your black money into your principal place of residence, because it just disappears. If you can build gold and sandstone walls in there, the government doesn't know where it comes from. I know that might be borderline, but it's true. If you put money into your principal place of residence, it's a fantastic way to save. And if you put money into commercial property, it's a fantastic way to get a return. And so long-term leases rather than short 12-month leases or whatever you get in residential are very beneficial because they allow you to plan.
Thanks, Ty. Wayne?
Oh, look, I think probably when you're looking at it from an investment point of view, do your research well. Look for areas where you know that there's not only good infrastructure going in now, but good future infrastructure going in, along all sorts of infrastructure, where not just from a point of view of rail lines and that, but large transport links, future employment growth, all that sort of thing, and speak to your local people. I think that's a big thing for me, is make sure you talk to local people who know the area well.
Great, thank you. And Mark? 1 minute, remember?
Yeah. Now, if you've already got an investment property, I'd urge you to have an assessment on that investment property and see how it's already performed and if there's something that could be possibly performing better. When people say it's a good time to buy or sell, well, it can be a good time to sell and buy. There could be a more preeminent area that's got a lot more growth in front of it. So I'm always happy to look at something that someone's got that they've had for 5 years, could have already had some good growth, could be some good equity there, but it could have slowed down compared to another area that's just about to go. So I'd say assess those investments and look at the drivers rather than just the individual bricks and mortar.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. Can you please join me in giving them a big hand? Now, I know some of you had a couple of property through super questions, but we're trying to keep this just about, the community of NFP and, our business partners and a light bit of education. So if you do have questions, we do have 4 specialist SMSF advisors here this evening, and we do invite you to join us for a drink at the bar, so feel free to approach them with your questions. Thank you.